So I thought about doing one of two things tonight. One was to deliver the same lecture that I just gave, but in 11 minutes. And the other was to just do the Lenny Bruce routine. But I actually want to do something a little bit different. I know, right? Lime soda, right? I want to talk a little bit more personally about why I have become skeptical about boundaries as a moral issue in the Jewish community. You heard me talk about it in the framework of my lecture, and now I want to dig a little bit deeper. A number of years ago, I read one of those books, one of those articles that all of us have had the experience of reading, where you're reading something and it doesn't matter whether it's the most literarily significant thing that you're reading. It doesn't necessarily present an idea that you haven't encountered before, but sticks with you and hangs around, and in my case, keeps showing up on source sheets, even though sometimes when I teach it, I'm not exactly sure where I want to go with it, but just because it held me in such a way, a mirror up to my own moral sensibilities and dispositions that required me to take it seriously in a very different way. This was the coda, the last chapter of the political philosopher Martha Nussbaum's book called For Love of Country, in which she hosts a debate in its pages between a number of philosophers about the relative merits of patriotism, loyalty to one's own group, or cosmopolitanism, a different vision of morality in which we see the world as essentially a shared city. And it's a beautiful book, and it has a whole pluralistic ethos underlying it, which is that she had an idea about the merits of universalism, cosmopolitanism, and instead of just advocating for that position, she invited others to write their responses. She collected all of them and published it. It's one of the most beautiful expressions I know of the idea of Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. You could all finish that sentence. These are all the living words of God, even if I come out on one particular place on this issue. And in this closing chapter, she talks about the experience of the visitor coming to the garden of the righteous Gentiles in Yad Vashem, which is not even 6 kilometers from here, in which I went back to visit about a month ago for the first time in a long time. And she describes walking past the trees that are dedicated to the memory of those righteous Gentiles who intervened, oftentimes at the cost of life and limb, on behalf of someone else who they most often didn't know, oftentimes impelled by religion, but more often than not impelled by what their religious teachers were telling them, and were capable of reaching across and transcending across human difference in order to pursue a fundamental ethical principle that at the moment felt obvious, which is that another human being is standing before them in need of their intervention. And even with profound risk that they were incurring in order to do so, some universal moral impulse surfaced within them and made them do something that might have been counter to their own interest. It's a stunning reminder, Nussbaum talks about, that all the difference-making adjectives that we use to describe ourselves relative to others, gender, place of birth, nationality, religion, class, creed, all of these adjectives interrupt or get in the way of a fundamental principle of human equality. And as a result, all of these adjectives actually kind of impair our capacity to see the fundamental moral equality of other human beings. They are not moral categories. They may be technologies that we have to use in order to be more in relationship to some people than others, for political reasons, for philanthropic reasons, to build community which could have its own type of moral value, but they are not morally compelling arguments in and of themselves. In essence, Nussbaum tells this story in order to re-articulate the radical idea that is the first idea of our Torah, that we often forget at our own peril, that our family's story of being a Jewish people originates not with a commitment to our group or our family or our religion, not to family, clan, tribe, people, peoplehood, nation. The fundamental moral claim that we are meant to make is to understand that every human being is created in the image of God. and that all of the failures that humans have, which make it difficult to build community around the commitment to other people being created in the image of God, require us to build structures of community which require boundaries and which are inherently b'di'avad. They inherently reflect a failure of moral imagination, of moral consciousness, to actually see past that difference and regard every human being as a moral equal. I've read this over and over again. It's challenging. All of us make behavioral choices in our lives. Sometimes those choices are made for us. Oftentimes we reinforce them or we change them. We do things like creating families which create a greater loyalty to those who are in our families than those who are not. We create choices to be part of particular communities at the cost of being part of other communities, sometimes for strategic reasons and sometimes for different political reasons, maybe in the pursuit of a different moral or ethical vision, but always doing something in drawing a boundary and drawing a distinction between those who we see ourselves as inherently relationship with and those who we do not. Each of those choices, I want to argue, is not an inherently moral choice, but actually a secondary, a subordinate choice then to the moral challenge of actually standing with this overwhelming, arresting moral principle of fundamental human equality. When I read this, and that's why I keep going back to it, it made me feel that all of the boundary work that we do in our community oftentimes positions itself as essentially about morality, why I care more about this person than that person, when all of it seems to constitute, at some deep level, a kind of human moral failure. The inability to see past difference, to regard other people as moral equals. Actually, the author Dara Horn talks about this as well in this wonderful Kindle single that she wrote about the rescuer Varian Fry. She talks about the fact that he goes to Europe and rescues many of Europe's artists and intellectuals. And in the context of telling the story, she describes how when people who do supererogatory moral things like that are asked, why did you intervene to do something when you have all of the reasons in the world not to, the most common answer that people will give is an inability to articulate a reason why. It's actually a source of optimism to believe that at our core, there is some lingering moral sensibility that recognizes that the differences that we erect with other human beings are actually the consequences of education, of incubation within the frameworks of boundaried communities that fail us because they erect difference between us as opposed to honoring a fundamental human impulse. This is where I think my skepticism about boundaries comes from. To recognize that they serve particular functions, but that they can never replace a notion of radical or fundamental human equality, and that more often than not, any of those other political functions that they serve wind up actually shortchanging our capacity to expand the vistas of our moral universe rather than helping us serve those very vistas. I want to share then instead some theory, a little bit of theory, about what boundaries can and can't do, maybe a model for American Jewish life that doesn't think about boundaries between people, communities, Jews and non-Jews as inherently moral activities, precisely because I think it's a dead end, morally speaking. I think it's a dead end, biblically speaking. Instead, I want to offer a different theory of boundaries. What if we said as follows, that all three of these following designations are actually different categories of belonging and affiliating? Jew, member of a Jewish community, and member of the Jewish people. And I want to resist the impulse to put these on any sort of spectrum. This piece of the talk is partly inspired by another article from my teacher who I referenced earlier, Shia Cohen, an article called Crossing the Boundary and Becoming a Jew, who notes that in antiquity, there were all sorts of ways, I think he has 7 or 8, in which someone who was not of the Jewish community could express some form of affiliating with or belonging to the Jewish community without doing the act of crossing the boundary and becoming a Jew. Becoming, in a modern example, part of a Jewish family. Another modern example, belonging to a Jewish communal institution, a synagogue, a Jewish community center, a federation, what have you. Or perhaps even expressing some sort of loyalty to the Jewish people, which doesn't necessarily reach the level of wanting to cross the boundary and become a member of the Jewish people. What's interesting about this model of membership is instead of thinking that these are on a spectrum, more to less, and instead of thinking that once you get into a discourse of boundaries, all of your boundaries are identical, we don't have to homogenize across these forms of membership and in order to cross all of these boundaries. What if instead we actually lived with the possibility that boundaries serve various political or strategic purposes when they're deployed in different places, and that they don't really morally matter more broadly than that? What's interesting about the theory like this, differentiating between being a Jew, a member of the Jewish people, and a member of a Jewish community, is that the State of Israel helps American Jews on this point. State of Israel already let the cat out of the bag by creating different categories of membership to the Jewish people in the framework of the state. From the standpoint of the religious ministry of the State of Israel, in order to actually be a Jew, you have to demonstrate your halachic bona fides. In order, however, to be a member of the Jewish people, broadly construed, in order to be able to get citizenship, they come up with a very different definition, which is roughly, if you were Jewish enough for Hitler, you're Jewish enough for us. One of 4 grandparents has to demonstrate some Jewishness in order to be able to be a member of the Jewish people for the purposes of Aliyah. I wonder what would happen to the conversation on boundaries in the American Jewish community if a single institution, a synagogue, didn't have to think about questions of boundaries beyond the particular needs of their own synagogue or beyond the particular framework of its denomination. I wonder what would happen if we had different expectations in different language in allowing for the possibility that someone can belong to a Jewish community, not be a Jew, and not be a member of the Jewish people. There are probably other categories of membership and belonging that would be there as well. I think that what happens to us is because we are concerned about boundaries, we make boundaries into moral issues. We become convinced that those who are inside the boundary with us are more important to us than those who are outside of that boundary, for reasons that are not moral, even if they may be strategic. And once we get into this business, we also begin to police boundaries identically. We think that how I answer the question, who is a Jew halachically, has to be the same set of answers that I offer for who can be a member of the Jewish community and who can be a member of the Jewish people. I want to challenge us tonight to think of universalism, this type of universal morality, as a charge for us to think about boundaries differently. One of my heroes who I'm inspired by, even as a tragic hero, is Ludwig Zamenhof, the founder of Esperanto, the visionary universal language, which obviously, as we know, had to be envisioned by someone who was Jewish. We have the possibility embedded in our tradition and embedded in our moral capacity of human beings to see past difference, to imagine that difference is not morally instructive, even if it's sometimes strategically and politically useful. I don't mean to dispense with the urgency of particular institutions, particular families, particular communities coming up with a narrative and a structure of boundaries that serve the particular needs of that community and institution. But if we remember that all of those activities are particular, that we are committed to a larger notion of a moral transcendence, a moral universalism, of fundamental human equality, of a commitment to genuinely believe when the Torah tells us that all human beings are created in the image of God, we have the possibility not only to have a different structure of Jewish communal life around boundaries to replace the one that is currently not working, a different set of frameworks that can enable us to build boundaries when they are needed and tear them down when they are not, and most importantly, we will remember that any boundaries that we create are temporarily useful if the ability to transcend boundaries is morally instructive. Thank you.
Yehuda Kurtzer.